They thought they'd provoke a reaction, that you would clench, shout, scramble to assert yourself the moment the pressure mounted. But you didn't. You sat there, arms resting like stone, expression unreadable, pulse slower than theirs. Because you didn't brace for impact, you welcomed it. The violence they expected to ignite you only brushed against you like old wind passing through an open door. That's what they never grasped. Some souls aren't preparing to survive anymore. They already did, long ago, privately, brutally. And that death, the one they never witnessed, is what taught you how to receive anything without flinching. You weren't indifferent. You were evolved. The kind of readiness you carried wasn't taught. It was earned through nights of psychic demolition, in rooms where you whispered truths to yourself that would have shattered other people permanently. You weren't reacting because you had already collapsed once and rebuilt without applause. They missed that. They miscalculated your silence as inaction, but your lack of resistance wasn't surrender. It was supremacy. You no longer wrestle with the inevitable. You let it pass through. Like weather, like grief, like betrayal. You learn that real power doesn't fight the wave. It becomes the ocean. And when you've drowned before, when you've willingly walked into the depths, let it strip you of everything artificial, watch your ego convulse and decay, you return different. Not louder, not more confident, just precise, composed, hollowed out of all unnecessary weight. And that makes you untouchable. Because now they're fighting a presence that no longer fears absence. They screamed, they pushed, they plotted, and you simply inhaled. You didn't resist, you received. The insults, the projections, the manipulation. It entered your field and found nothing to latch onto. You'd already named your demons, already traced your blame back to its origin and absorbed it like firewood. They were attacking a version of you that no longer exists. You became a ghost before they even knew how to haunt you. And that dissonance, that spiritual delay between who they expected and who you became, cracked their strategies open. They needed you to panic, but panic requires expectation. You had none. You walked into the chaos expecting to be misunderstood, and that expectation freed you from all need to prove. You weren't trying to be seen. You weren't trying to be right. You weren't even trying to win. You were simply there, present, listening with the kind of depth that made them feel exposed. People hate mirrors that don't flatter them. And you, without effort, became one, reflecting back every insecurity they injected into the air. You said little, but your stillness screamed, because nothing is louder than someone who's not afraid of being misread. That's the part that undid them. You weren't defending yourself, because you no longer owed the world an explanation. When you've already died once, you learn that truth doesn't require performance. It only requires embodiment. And you wore yours like an invisible shield. They thought survival was a look. They didn't realize it was an absence. The absence of flinch. The absence of desperation. The absence of delay between decision and action. You had nothing left to protect, because you already lost everything that was built on illusion. You let it all rot. Your reputation, your comfort, your scripted identity. And from that decay, something else emerged. Something they couldn't decode because it had no surface. It was all core, all center, no decoration, no dependence. That's why you didn't resist. You didn't need to. You had already faced what they were trying to scare you with and found it laughable in hindsight. You watched them tighten their grip on every tactic, like chess players convinced they were 5 moves ahead. But your game wasn't on that board. You didn't play to corner the king. You became the storm that rendered the board irrelevant. And storms don't checkmate. They erase, they swallow, and they do it silently. While they layered complexity, you purified. While they shouted, you sharpened. While they sought approval, you buried your identity beneath layers of earned understanding. That's why, when they struck, you barely blinked. Because what they hit wasn't a body, it was bone. Something that had already calcified through pain they couldn't imagine surviving once. You trained for the hit by living in it. Not for a day, not for a season, but for years. Every disappointment became a rite. Every betrayal a muscle tear. And you didn't rush to recover. You sat in it, let it slice, let it shape. You treated pain like scripture, and eventually, it handed you answers they could never read. So when the moment came, the one they orchestrated so carefully, you didn't dodge. You leaned in, not to submit, to signal that nothing they throw could outmatch what you've already endured by your own hand. You weren't passive. You were past the need to guard yourself from inevitability. They keep asking each other how you didn't collapse. They study tapes, conversations, glances. They think there's a cue they missed, a flaw in the strategy. But there's nothing to study because the lesson isn't external. You didn't outmaneuver them. You outlasted yourself. You let every part of you that needed attention, applause, explanation, die. And what was left wasn't a persona, it was a presence. They don't know how to fight presence. Because presence has no angle, no script, just gravity. And now they orbit you pretending not to feel the pull. He had been promised an easy job. They spoke of you with such casual disdain, like you were a loose end that simply needed trimming. A man who'd lost his edge, isolated, vulnerable, a creature of impulse, they said, one they could predict, corner, erase. They gave him until they thought was sufficient your habits, your routines. Old pain, rehashed and wrapped in confident assumptions. They showed him clips of your old self, photos taken mid-fall, audio leaks of your breakdowns. He studied them like scripture, confident that he knew what kind of man he'd be facing. But what they failed to grasp, and what shattered him upon arrival, was that you weren't frozen in the past. You had grown, mutated, not upwards, not towards redemption, but inwards, deep and dense like a black hole. You didn't shine, you consumed. What broke him wasn't what you did. It was what you didn't do. He expected chaos. He expected defensiveness. He expected rage. But when he stepped into your presence, what greeted him was something colder than indifference and hotter than hell. You acknowledged him without a blink, without tension in your shoulders, no movement to suggest alarm, because you knew the rhythm of betrayal too well. You had memorized its footsteps. You could smell its breath before it even entered the room. You didn't brace, you welcomed. Not as a fool, but as someone who had already danced with destruction and learned to enjoy the music. He watched for fear in your eyes and saw none, only understanding. Only the gaze of someone who has witnessed the worst in people and chose to become the kind of entity that doesn't flinch anymore. He tried to read you. Everyone tries at first. They scan your silence for weakness, mistake your lack of resistance for passivity. But your quiet wasn't void. It was surveillance. You had already watched him before he entered. Watched the world twist itself trying to erase you. Watched the hands that fed you shift into claws. Watched love dress up as pity. Watched pity dress up as control. And you remembered, not out of bitterness, but for clarity. You watched to understand the patterns, to build immunity. So when they sent someone to finish you, they didn't know you had already done the job yourself. You had already buried the version they feared, the emotional one, the responsive one, the one who still had something to lose. What was left now couldn't be finished. It could only be witnessed, and witnessing it ruined him. You didn't speak. That's what disarmed him first, because assassins rely on the chatter, the tremble in the voice, the justified monologues, the panic disguised as strength. But you gave him none of it. You offered him the one thing the weak cannot interpret: serenity. Not peace, not safety, but that eerie, surgical serenity that only comes from a man who has dissected his own destruction and stitched himself back without anesthesia. You looked like a man, but felt like something older, something carved out of necessity and violence. He didn't feel like he was approaching an opponent. He felt like he was stepping into judgment, and judgment, when unspoken, becomes unbearable. He was trained for physical resistance, not spiritual detachment. His weapons were calibrated for men still holding on to something. A grudge, a lover, a future. But you had nothing left to bargain with. You weren't tethered to dreams anymore. You had walked through too many nights where sleep mocked you. Nights where betrayal wasn't loud. It was subtle, lingering, dripping. Nights where you realized no one was coming to explain why. and you had to survive on questions. That kind of survival makes you quiet, not out of fear, but focus. He had no idea how to navigate someone who wasn't playing to win. Someone who already had, he tried to provoke you. They all do. A smirk, a comment, a nudge, something to make you blink. But you've seen worse than him. Worse than death. You've seen yourself at your weakest and didn't look away. You stood inside your own mind when it was trying to destroy you, and you didn't beg for help. You just watched. You watched the collapse like a storm watcher, studying, enduring, understanding. So when a man shows up with threats and pride, all he brings is noise. And noise doesn't scare someone who's already survived silence. He came to tear down a structure. What he found was a foundation built underground, untouchable, unseen, unfazed. He reported back to them eventually, not with words, but with absence. He left you, but didn't return whole. They thought he'd return with blood. Instead, he returned with silence. That's how you ruin people like him. Not by defeating them in battle, but by showing them the existence of something beyond their comprehension. You became a mirror he couldn't shatter, a contradiction he couldn't explain. You were human, yet not human. Made of flesh, yet immune to every pressure they thought would crack you. Because you didn't build walls, you dissolved your ego. An ego is what they aim at. Without it, they shoot into smoke. They sit now in rooms with closed doors, debating what to do with you. But they all feel it, that helplessness, that dread. Because if one man can survive what you've survived and return without bitterness, without vengeance, but with silence and presence, what else is possible? You shattered their illusion. That power is noise. That survival is savagery. That dominance is display. You made survival look sacred, made pain look like training, made endurance look poetic. And that terrifies people who depend on chaos to feel in control. They underestimated what it means to complete yourself in private, to crawl through hell alone, then return with calm instead of fury. They planned for an explosion, but they got erosion. Slow, subtle, consistent erosion of their influence, their confidence, their assumptions. You didn't win. You changed the metric. You became something that can't be killed because it already buried every weakness they depend on. What's left now walks without need. And needlessness, true needlessness, is terrifying because it can't be baited, bought, or broken. They walked in with threats dressed as strategy, with warnings coded in rehearsed concern, thinking they could unnerve you with scenarios they barely understood themselves. But you had already lived it. They tried dangling isolation in front of you, whispering exile like it was a death sentence. They thought you'd panic at the idea of walking alone. They had no clue that solitude was your original birthplace. They didn't know the kind of silence you had survived, where the only sound was your own mind rehearsing every mistake, where every hour crawled like a ghost across your spine. You had already been to that place. You'd built furniture in that place, decorated it, laughed in it. So when they weaponized loneliness, they didn't realize they were offering you comfort. You didn't flinch. You remembered. They came with the threat of being misunderstood, of being labeled, smeared, framed, as if that would unhinge you. But they were late. You had already walked through rooms where your name was mentioned like a warning, where eyes narrowed not because of who you were, but because of what you couldn't be controlled into becoming. You'd already stood on trial in people's minds, sentenced by those who knew fragments of you, judged by people who needed you to be the villain so they could feel like the victim. That injustice. You wore it like armor. Because once you know that truth bends for the insecure, the lies stop mattering. They thought their whispers would shake you. They didn't realize you were made in the dark they now fear. They assumed rejection would cut deep, that if enough doors slammed, you'd begin to break. But you learned long ago that the worst rejection isn't external. It's the one you offer yourself when you abandon your own instinct to appease their expectations. That's the war you already won. You no longer knock to be let in. You built corridors in your own mind and found shelter in the corners no one dared enter. So when they tried to lock you out, you smiled. Because the house was burning anyway, and you'd already memorized the exits. They planned to exile you, but forgot that you had already exiled yourself from their systems, their politics, their pretend loyalty. They tried silence, hoping you'd suffocate without affirmation, as if your worth had ever been measured in their noise. But you had already survived nights where the silence wasn't empty. It was loud, deafening. And yet you listened to every cruel echo, every doubt, every internal scream that tried to convince you were failing. You didn't run from it. You let it tear through your bones. You sat in that stillness until your breath became rhythm and your mind became terrain. They don't know that kind of silence. They only fear it. They weaponized absence, unaware that it's where you were reborn. Your detachment wasn't cold, it was earned. They used mockery like fire, hoping you'd melt. But yourself, image no longer relied on applause or protection. You've already heard every version of the insult. You've already watched people twist kindness into manipulation, watched sincerity get painted as arrogance, watched intelligence get punished by mediocrity. You learned to stop defending yourself when truth was irrelevant to those trying to hurt you. That immunity came at a cost, and you paid it in full, with dignity. So when they laughed or dismissed you, they weren't belittling you. They were exposing themselves, their limitations, their inability to comprehend someone no longer performing for validation. They came for your reputation. That's the easiest target. They thought if they could smear the surface, they could stain the soul. But what they didn't grasp is that you had already let the world misunderstand you on purpose. You had already burned your own image to save your substance. Reputation means nothing to someone who has learned to live without applause.